So for this project, I ended up using a canvas that I had already drawn on, so ignore that part. I always start by tacking down the edges of my canvas so that when I put it flat, it doesn't move around and it doesn't like make any funny noises while I'm trying to brush paint onto it. You don't have to do this. I add water to the back of it, especially because this canvas is on the cheaper side of things. It's a back staple canvas, which is not bad, but it does mean that it bends a little bit more because the tension is not as great. So if you add water to the back, that helps tighten the canvas, especially as it dries. If I don't add a little bit of moisture to the back of the canvas, and it's totally fine, you can absolutely do that. I just find that it's a lot harder to cover the large surface, but when I add water, it gets a lot easier and a lot smoother. So regardless of whether I have a drawing on here that I'm trying to cover up or not, I typically will start with a layer of white, especially while I'm adding a sky. So I want a nice gradient from darker on top to medium to light towards the horizon. That's gonna help me with my atmospheric perspective. Atmospheric perspective is essentially just when things look like they're getting farther away because the atmosphere is in the way, right? Farther away you get, the more atmosphere there is between you and that object, and therefore it's going to be lighter, it's going to be hazier, and it's actually going to be a little more blue. While I'm doing this, the white paint has not dried yet. If your paint has dried, you can absolutely still create a gradient, but it's going to be a little different than my process. What I've done in the past is I've just added an extra layer of white and used that to blend my blue. Blending a larger space like this and creating a gradient at the same time can actually be pretty difficult, and it's something that might take a little bit of practice. So if you're not getting it right now, don't worry about it too much. All you gotta do is just keep going, keep practicing, and it will start to click. If you are painting and you're noticing a lot of lines or a lot of uneven pieces, I would start paying attention to how you're putting your brush down and how you're picking your brush up. If you swoop it, it's going to feather out the color, versus if you just press it down and push, then it's going to start with a harder line and then it's going to change as it goes. So depending on what you're hoping for, which in this instance, I'm hoping for a more feathered look, I have to be very careful about how lightly and how much of an angle I put my brush down at. As you're going, make sure you adjust it, step back every now and then, take note of anything that's kind of out of place. If you need to, you can wait for it to dry and come back and adjust it later and add another layer. No harm in doing that. I do it all the time. So my next step is going to be to add the ground. The grass field is really all we're going to see. There's not going to be a lot of detail to it. I'm just using Hooker's green, and I added a little bit of white, but the white that I'm putting on top of is still kind of wet, so it's going to end up blending together as I'm going across the page. As I get farther down the canvas, I want to add a little bit of blue, and I want to add a lot more green to make it darker towards the bottom. It's not going to be a perfect gradient right now, especially with the white paint, so we're going to come back later with a little bit of a highlight right along the horizon line. That's going to help us with our atmospheric perspective. After we have our green down and the sky is at least mostly dry, hopefully all the way dry, but I'm not always patient enough, we're gonna go in with a round brush, scoop a dollop of white, and you're just gonna start using little circular motions to create our clouds. I always say that if you're seeing the clouds from a distance rather than from directly underneath, there's going to be a bit of a flat bottom. If you make it too floofy all the way around, it's gonna start looking like the Toy Story clouds. And then you're gonna wanna make sure that they're not all the same size. As they get closer to the horizon line, they're gonna be thinner and they're gonna be a lot smaller, as opposed to like as it gets closer to the top of the canvas, you're gonna want it fluffier and you're gonna want it a lot bigger. Again, this is gonna force some perspective and it's gonna create some good depth. For these clouds, I'm not adding much shadow. I'm literally just letting it blend as it goes. I think in my tutorial, I'm not waiting for the blue to dry, so it kind of ends up as a light blue rather than just plain white. I'm totally fine with that. That kind of creates some good shadows without really trying. And then once it dries all the way, I'm gonna go in with another dollop of white and just kind of add it to the tops. Because this is a pretty simple tutorial, I'm not going to add a lot of detail. I'm not gonna add a lot of shadows or highlights, stuff like that, I'm just gonna keep it relatively simple. The most I'm gonna do is I'm going to add little wisps going horizontally off of it. I think it helps make it so it's not too uniform and kind of gives you an idea of the fact that it's actually just water vapor up there. It's not a solid object, and that is something that your brain knows until you look at it and you're like, why does this not look like a regular cloud? I would check and see if they look a little too uniform or a little too man-made. Your brain does a lot of that processing for you, and it's hard to pick it out sometimes. So just take a step back, see if they look a little bit too round or a little too the same. Kind of switch it up a little bit. What I'll do is I'll just add an extra bump. I'll just add an extra bump to one of them, or make one bigger, or just, you know, kind of change it up a little bit. So I did speed up this part of the video, but I'm basically just fleshing out the rest of this cloud. You can see in here that I'm actually a little bit aggressive with my paintbrush, and I feel like that's something that a lot of people avoid. And I think it's a good instinct because you don't want to hurt your brush, you don't want to do anything that you might regret. But also remember that in something like this, you actually have a pretty small amount of risk, and you can absolutely afford to kind of push a little bit harder on your paintbrush. Especially if you don't have a lot of paint on your brush, go ahead and just push it in there. Something called dry brushing is actually very helpful when it comes to painting clouds. This is essentially when you have a pretty dry brush, just like the name implies, but with like the smallest amount of paint on it, so that when you push it into the canvas, a very subtle amount goes on, and it is my favorite technique for creating clouds because you want that wispier look. You want it to be softer, and you want it to imply that there's a lot of mist and there's a lot of water vapor up there. The last thing that we're gonna add here is the grass. Now for the grass, my favorite brush ever is going to come into play. It is the fan brush. Using your fan brush to create a grass technique makes the process go so much faster, and it gives you a lot of texture really quickly. I start with the darker color, so I'm going to start with the darkest green that I've used in this painting so far, and just start dabbing my fan brush onto the canvas. Now I start at the bottom because, of course, like we've talked about, our atmospheric perspective says that it's darker on the bottom and lighter as it gets towards the horizon line. As we're doing this, we're just covering a lot of the canvas right now. As we get higher up on the canvas, we're going to start adding our lighter values. Now the lighter values are not hard to make. Basically all I do is I just take my brush that already has green on it, and I just dip it in the white paint and just start dabbing my fan brush onto the canvas. Now I start at the bottom because, of course, like we've talked about, our atmospheric perspective says that it's darker on the bottom and lighter as it gets towards the horizon line. As we get higher up on the canvas, we're going to start adding our lighter values. Now the lighter values are not hard to make. Basically all I do is I just take my brush that already has green on it, and I just dip it in the white paint and then just keep on dabbing. Basically just move my hand side to side across the canvas, dabbing as I go along, and then the paint kind of blends itself. And you just make sure you add a little bit more white as you get higher up. So I sped up this part of the video as well, and if you are more interested in a more in-depth video on how to do grass, I am more than happy to work on that for you. A lot of these are going to be tutorials that build on each other, so it's going to seem kind of simple and kind of pointless, but I don't want you to think of it that way. I want you to think of it as building blocks or puzzle pieces to build your skill set and to be able to build on one on top of the other. So I want you to take this painting and I want you to either enjoy it as it is, or you can even customize it to your own ideas. I've had people that will change up the colors and you have a different color scheme. I've had people that will incorporate different characters into their scene so that they can tell their own story. It's really cool how customizable it is, and I would love to see if you guys do that. To add the shadow underneath the cloud, you're really just taking, this is where my cloud is, go down, and then depending on how far from the horizon it is, that's where you're gonna add just a darker patch of green. Doesn't have to be any definition to it. It just needs to be darker. Then you're gonna take your brush, whether it's a fan brush, a flat brush, a round brush, and you're going to make diagonal strokes. And you're just gonna keep swiping it through until you feel pretty satisfied about it. Remember earlier when we were talking about how you lay your brush down, that's gonna help you avoid a lot of those harsher brush strokes. You want them to kind of blend together. Once you're done with your painting, I want you to sign it. This is something that most of my students don't want to do, but I feel like it's vitally important, not only so that people know who painted it, but so that you know that you painted it. And at the end of this tutorial, it's a pretty simple landscape, but I really want to see if you guys recreate this or if there's anything that you learned or anything that you feel like I didn't touch on enough and would like to hear more about.